works with a number of regional organizations to fight this issue. I'll just mention 3 here. African Union. Many people don't know that it even exists. It's kind of in the shadow. It's not as integrated or as powerful as the European Union, but it's there. It promotes integration, free movement of people, etc. And it's actually the only regional organization which has a charter on the rights of welfare of the child. EU doesn't have that yet. There are other ways that the EU is protecting the rights of the children, but the African Union is the first regional body to actually have charter on the rights of the child. And they clearly, in this charter, they clearly define children as anybody under 18, and they say anybody under 18 cannot be used in any kinds of conflict, direct, indirect, just. European Union, there are guidelines on children and armed conflict, and NATO. EU also works, United Nations work with NATO on training, and basically that NATO soldiers or functionaries, when they're deployed to the field, that they know what to look for and what to pay attention to. And also there are discussions ongoing with the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation on this issue. So some are more advanced, some are less, but basically all major international organizations, regional organizations are aware of this issue. Okay, we can. I told you I will bring several examples. That's the final part of my presentation. I chose 5 examples of recent use of child soldiers. One was Sierra Leone, civil war for about 10 years, more than 50,000 victims. But after the war, it's one of the success stories of the UN transition. There was a UN peacekeeping mission which helped organize elections, and the special court, which I mentioned just a bit earlier, which tried Charles Taylor of the neighboring Liberia for what his forces did in Sierra Leone. UNICEF, again, an example of UNICEF work. Key agency, more than 7,000 children were saved or released from the armed groups in Sierra Leone alone. And UNICEF did a very good job in reintegrating them and bringing them back home. But what was the key to success in Sierra Leone? As I mentioned, community support. So basically, UNICEF had to work with communities to prepare them for the arrival of child soldiers or returnees. So it's a two-way street in a way. You cannot just bring children back and say, here they are. You need to prepare the community. Yes, 50 of your children who are missing for 5 years are coming back. You know, you need to prepare schools for them, etc. Somalia, less positive example. Civil war for almost 25 years. Since 2009, there is a transitional authority, and there are African Union forces, AMISOM, and as you know, you are aware of Al-Shabaab, extremist militia. Most recent example of their violence was attack on the university in Kenya, and then the shopping mall a year ago. Child soldiers are still being used in Somalia, definitely by Al-Shabaab, there is no doubt about that, but probably also by the government forces. Somebody from the government once said, and this is a quote, "We're trying to find anybody who could carry a gun," because Somalia is really in a terrible shape, financially, politically, etc. Al-Shabaab is still quite powerful, so the government at one point really tried to recruit anybody just to fight the insurgency. They did sign an action plan. They did promise they would fight the issue. We believe that the goodwill is there, but the reality is unfortunately different. It's still not applicable. There are still too many issues, and so Somalia, yes, we want to see some movement, but it's still really not moving. Democratic Republic of the Congo, one of the most difficult conflicts in the world, most long-lasting conflict. The government committed in 2012 to take care of this issue. What I say here, bilateral pressure helped. So bilateral pressure helps. For example, in the case of the Congo, they are reluctant to sign an agreement with the UN about child soldiers. But then UN could not impose sanctions because some members of the Security Council blocked it. But then bilateral pressure in this particular case by the United States helped. United States said, okay, you're not going to deal with this issue. We're going to cut bilateral aid to your official army. And soon enough, DRC signed the plan. Does it mean they're implementing it? It's debatable. There are still at least 3,000 children estimated to be in armed groups in Congo. M23, one of the most notorious militias, is now defeated, but there are others. And the largest UN peacekeeping mission is in the Congo, actually, and they have a mandate to protect civilians. So this is, I told you that the UN peacekeeping missions have different mandates. Some are more traditional, some are there basically to stand in between the two sides, but not to intervene. MONUSCO, the mission in Africa, mission in Congo, is quite proactive. It's the one that can actually use force to protect civilians. So if they see a violation of human rights by any group, they can actually use force against this group to save people. So it's one of the more, let's say, we call it third generation peacekeeping, more proactive, more forceful. Colombia, so it's not only in Africa. In Colombia, both FARC and the government have been using child soldiers. The government mostly for spying purposes. As I told you, children are, some see them as perfect spies because they are young, unsuspectful, they look innocent, they can collect information without anybody noticing. So the government was using children primarily for spying. FARC was using them for fighting. But now recently they said they would not use anybody under the age of 17. And that's one of the issues in the negotiations that are ongoing in these recent months. And my final example is Syria. Very, very sad story of civil war and international failure to intervene, to react. At least 11,000 children have been killed in 4 years and 1 month of fighting now. Numerous armed groups use children. There is no doubt about that. They are not used, we believe, they are not used by the official Syrian army, by the state forces, but there are enough other players in the field which use them. One of them, the Free Syrian Army, which used to be a major group, but now it's not so much, they promised they would stop using children in their forces, but it's hard to prove it in reality. Our access to Syria is quite limited, except for humanitarian aid. ISIS has been using children as young as 5. There are some testimonies from children who were released, and there are testimonies of children who were forced to watch beheadings, who were given knives to cut heads of people. So very, very early indoctrination. And imagine the mental damage to those children, even if they are released, if they survive the conflict. What do you do with somebody who is 7, who already killed 10 people? Where do you start? I mean, that's, when I talk about reintegration, it's a major issue. Is that that girl or boy is scarred for life? But also, children have been used for suicide bombings. Most recent case was actually in Nigeria a few months ago, not in Syria, when a 7-year-old girl they put explosives around her and sent her into a Boko Haram, in this case, not ISIS. They sent her into a crowded market because who would expect a 7-year-old girl to be a suicide bomber? Basically, and the final point here is this lost generation. That's a very, very serious issue. UNICEF started the campaign about 6 months ago, because what Syria is facing is really a lost generation of children who are not going to school, who are not getting education, who are traumatized. We're not talking about children used in armed forces. Even without that, their life is very, very difficult. And what we can do to avoid, you can even find it on social media, like Syrian lost generation. There are a lot of good ideas, good intentions, but then reality, the hard force is still not there. So Syrian kids are losing it basically every day. And we are globally losing the fight to save them. And to conclude some of the main points that I would like you to remember from this presentation. So for one reason or the other, children used in armed conflict have been receiving increasing attention since early 1990s, the end of the Cold War, as I said. The number of dirty wars is increasing, but also the attention of global society, international community on the rights of the children. Multiple UN bodies are engaged in this issue, from the Security Council to the Special Representative on Children in Armed Conflict, UNICEF, Committee on the Rights of the Child, even ICC. So it is getting a lot of attention by the UN. Security Council still remains divided on the issue of sanctions, stronger action against some perpetrators. Basically, we know who the perpetrators are, but the big five, the permanent five, cannot often agree what to do about it. To punish those countries, economic sanctions or something else. So that's why the action is missing. Yes, there are action plans with many countries. They have committed to, working on this issue, but follow-up is needed. So Somalia has an action plan, but what has been done in reality? Democratic Republic of the Congo has an action plan, but what has been done in reality? It's good, we need action plans because they define who does what and which time frame, but what happens after that, that's equally, if not more important. All states are invited to ratify and implement the optional protocol. I told you the Convention on the Rights of the Child has 3 optional protocols. One of them deals with children and armed conflict. And at the moment, there are about 155, 160 signatories. So there are still about 30 countries who could sign and ratify. What makes a difference in the end? Political will of states. So Somalia signed this action plan because it didn't want to be singled out as the only country that didn't have the action plan. But then to implement it, sometimes you need bilateral pressure. If a big donor country decides to cut funding to, let's say, your army, if you don't implement it, it can make a difference. And international status also. Some countries are genuinely concerned about the international status and reputation. So, for example, if you want to send your peacekeepers to a UN peacekeeping mission, your army and your state needs to meet certain standards. So this helped in the case of Chad, for example, because Chad had also issues with child soldiers, but they also wanted to participate in several peacekeeping missions. And UN said, no, wait a moment. First you need to implement this, this, and this at home, deal with the issue, and then we can accept your peacekeepers. And that actually helped. So international reputation and international status are factors for some countries. But then the problem is what you do with those groups, extremist groups, which don't care about their status, who actually want to appear to be as brutal as possible. And again, I come back to ISIS, because their goal is actually to be quite the contrary, not to have good reputation, but to appall the humanity. And finally, multiple crises around the world. The world, I mean, many aspects, in many regards, the world is in a really, really terrible state with so many conflicts at the moment. Wherever you turn, there are conflicts. And there is just not enough focus and enough of resources to deal with this particular topic when there are so many issues to deal with. I work in Geneva, and I'm there. It's as you know, the headquarters of humanitarian capital of the world, and we get the idea of how much need there is and how little supply there is in terms of, let's say, funding, because the rich world is still recovering slowly from a financial crisis of 5 years ago, but the demand is as high as ever. So which crisis do you support? Do you try to support, I don't know, refugees in Lebanon, 1 million refugees in Lebanon, or you support besieged civilians in Ukraine, or most have forgotten about Central African Republic, but there are still fights between anti-Balaka and Seleka. So there are so many countries. Yemen now is burning. So what do you do? Where do you spend the resources? And on that not such positive note, I will conclude my presentation, and then we can take questions. Thank you.